Well, hello, everybody, and we want to welcome everybody to the Hurdy Burke Internet Broadcast Network. We are doing this live podcast interview with D.A. Featherling, and we're going to be talking to her and introducing her in a few minutes. But for you logged in right now listening, we've got quite a few of you. Thank you. I'm asking if you go ahead and mute your phones. I appreciate that, so I have a background noise. Before I get started with I know her as Dorothy, but D.A. Featherling, as we're going to introduce her in a minute. I want to take a few minutes and thank our exclusive sponsor, which is CPR Cell Phone in Round Rock, Texas. They fix everything on cell phones and tablets, iPads, iPhones, and they are the exclusive sponsor of the Hurdy Burke Internet Broadcast Network for 2015. Dorothy's in for a treat after this show's over. We're going to create her a place on YouTube for this podcast, and I'm going to build her own custom player with links to all her, where you can buy her books, her website, some About Me information, and even an email script, Dorothy, where people can get a hold of you and if they've listened to the show and send you some email. So I hope you think that's cool. So welcome to the show, Dorothy.
Yes, thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
And I want to say one more thing about my sponsor. You guys can find that sponsor at www.cellphonerepair.com. Please check them out. They're located in Round Rock, Texas at La Frontera, and we want to thank you guys for being the exclusive sponsor. So, with no further ado, Dorothy, welcome. I'm glad to have you tonight.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
And I want to go ahead and introduce her. I've known Dorothy for a few years. She's an author. And tonight we have the wonderful author, D.A. Featherling. And Dorothy is a multi-published award-winning author. She lives in the thriving, wonderful community of Georgetown, Texas. She is known for her fiction a la carte. We're going to explain what that is later. That means she's written in several different genres. So pretty much has something for everybody, which that's not always the case for a lot of authors. She's also recently published her first nonfiction book, and we'll talk a little bit more about all this in a few minutes. Welcome to the show, Dorothy.
Thank you, Hurdy. I'm delighted to be here.
Isn't it kind of cool? We can talk on the phone. You don't have to drive through the rain to get to me tonight. Isn't that nice?
It is. It's great.
I think we're going to get a little rain here in Austin, Texas, too. So, Dorothy, our crack staff, actually you, the crack staff, came up with 10 questions that we want to ask you about your books and being an author. And so the first question that I want to dive into is you've published 9 books in the past 2.5 years. That's just crazy. Have you been creative all your life, or did it not show up until adulthood?
Well, you know, Hurdy, I have been creative and curious all my life. As a child, my reading usually led me to find things that I wanted to try out. So my dolls all became pioneers who were scalped by the Indians. And needless to say, my parents finally caught on to that by about my 8th or 9th birthday and quit buying me dolls because they knew what their fate was going to be. My sister and I used to dig for uranium in a vacant lot next door, and we made a huge hole for 2 little girls. And we also liked to play astronauts up on top of the roof of my grandfather's workshop. I even tried to fry an egg one time on a rock during an extra hot summer because I'd heard it's hot enough to fry an egg on a sidewalk or a rock. So I tried it to see if it would really work, but found out that semi-cooked raw egg is not a pretty sight.
I was going to ask you, did it work or not? No.
It was not nice. My dad my childhood creativity peaked when I did something that had warranted stern punishment, and I knew I was in for a spanking. I'd read about a kid who was in the same situation, and he slipped a book in the rear end of his jeans before he was spanked. I thought that sounded like a pretty good idea and would keep the spanking from being felt, so before I went to face the music, I slipped a book down inside the back of my blue jeans. Well, my dad, bless his heart, he was always a softy, and when he told me, as usual, that this was going to hurt him more than it did me, I knew this time he might be right. But then he blew my whole pot. He evidently realized that a spanking through heavy jeans would barely be felt, so he told me to drop my jeans. Well, what was I going to do? I slowly undid the waistband of my jeans and heard the book drop out onto the floor. Well, he stared at me, and I stared at him, and then he burst out laughing and just hooted. It did get me out of a spanking that time, but I was really sorry. I'd never really be able to try it again to see if it worked. So, yeah, creativity played a large part in my childhood.
Yeah, and I know that from being around you also. So what part has reading played in your writing, Dorothy? I know you do a lot of reading. What has that done for you to get you motivated to do what you're doing with your books?
I do. I've always been a reader, even, again, since childhood. I kind of had this mental picture of a giant metal bucket, kind of like those old-fashioned milk pails, kind of like I have one poised over my head. And I've always imagined that every word that I've ever read, whether it was books or newspapers or magazines or the back of cereal boxes, all those words went into the bucket. And I kind of like to think that when it filled up and the words started spilling back out, that maybe that was time for me to write. But I always liked to get in the mood when I was reading when I was growing up, because I can remember one of my favorite books used to be the classic Heidi, about the little Swiss girl that lived in the Alps with her grandfather and herded goats. Well, Heidi always, her meals consisted of a bowl of goat's milk and a piece of cheese and bread. So I would get my book and I would go get me a piece of bread and cheese and pour some milk in a bowl, being careful, of course, that my mom didn't see me. And then I'd go in the bedroom and have my snack and read my book. And I really felt like I was one with the story. So reading has definitely had an impact in my life.
Gave you a lot of ideas, did it?
Oh, definitely. Some not so good, some better, but yeah, it's definitely had an impact. And I think it's helped increase my vocabulary and just given me a trigger to start the imagination process to spinning.
And that's awesome. And you had mentioned up in the first question that you've written 9 books in 2.5 years, but when did you actually start writing books?
Well, I didn't really start writing creatively until later in life. There's been a little bit of writing, I guess, in all the jobs I've held over the years, but none of it was really what I'd call creative writing. For many years, I was a single parent, and so I had a lot to occupy my time, but back in about 1998 or 99, I read an article in Reader's Digest, and it was talking about doing what you really want to do in the world in the lifetime that you have. And they asked a question, and this is kind of a paraphrase. They said if you didn't have to consider education or training or finances or time, if you could do anything in the world that you wanted to do as a career, what would it be? Well, an answer popped into my mind without my even thinking about it. I'd write books. That kind of surprised me because I'd never even thought about that before. So I kind of shrugged and forgot about it for a while. But every so often the idea came back and crossed my mind again. I finally got tired of it surfacing and lectured myself to forget it. But one day I finally thought, how are you ever going to know you can't do it unless you try? So
Absolutely.
that was when I started trying. I was working full-time, so I began my first novel during my lunch hour. I'd shove my sandwich down and then reread what I'd written the day before. Then I had about 15 or 20 minutes to keep on with the story, and eventually that turned into my first completed novel.
And here you are, right?
Here
9 later.
9 books later.
I think it's awesome. So we all know this is true, Dorothy, as an author, I'm pretty sure. I imagine on this path, this journey, there's been some detours to becoming a novelist. Can you explain some of those to our listeners that might be up-and-coming authors that are going to listen to your show later?
Sure. There have been a few detours. I guess everybody has those in life, but I went through several years after I first started writing, mainly in my spare time. Started learning about writing. I went to some writing conferences, learned how to pitch my books to editors and agents, had an agent for a couple of years, and then, as they say, life intervened. Had some family health issues that came up with my parents, and so the writing kind of dropped into the hobby category more than me trying to seriously pursue it as a career. And then, I guess about 6 years ago, I think my creative urge got stronger, but I went in a different direction to scratch the creative itch. A friend of mine told me about a career called home staging, where you go in and help folks get their house ready to sell. And she said, well, let's go into business together and do this. So we explored the possibilities, and once we did, she backed out. But I thought, no, I'd like to do that. So I went ahead and started in it. And so for the last 6, going on 7 years, I've had a home staging business. And the writing, again, stayed on the back burner. About January, I guess, 2013, I had one of those epiphanies you hear about. I was thinking about it, and, I thought, before I get too old to do it, I really want to see my name on a book. So I decided to seriously pursue publication. At that point in time, I did have several completed novels, but none of them had yet been published. I didn't realize, of course, that seeing my name on that first book cover wasn't really going to satisfy me. So I discovered I wanted to see my name on all the books I'd written. And so that's the goal that I've been pursuing since then.
Any major kind of writer's block, or is this just information just flow out of you during your writing? And that's kind of a question I want to ask.
Sure. Yeah, actually, I don't know that I've ever had writer's block as such. Every time I go anywhere and see anything, people, situations, it can be the grocery store, it could be, the mall, whatever it might be, you always see something, a writer always sees something that might trigger a thought, or you hear a little phrase of something on the radio or the TV and think, boy, that would make a great plot for a novel. So there's just inspiration all around. I've got a folder about 3 inches thick of ideas that for books that I've had over the years. May never get them all written, of course, but at least...
Done 9. That's good.
So far, no writer's block.
And here's a question that's not on your sheet I wanted to ask you is, I am, as you write all these books and come up with ideas, what I'm hearing you saying is your awareness is at a high level. Is that true?
Yeah, well, yes and no. I mean, obviously I'm human, I'm normal, and sometimes I'm oblivious, especially if I'm doing something that's not terribly exciting like buying groceries. So I don't always necessarily see it, but I guess the writing antennae are kind of out all the time because sometimes I'll maybe be, looking at something down the aisle in the grocery store, but I'll see something or somebody that does something unusual or looks a little bit different or maybe says something to somebody they're with, and that just sort of triggers the thought process in my mind. So it's kind of hard to block it out. I guess the imagination is just there, and it
just keeps flowing, right?
Yeah, just keeps on.
Hey, another question for you. This is a good time to take a break before we get the next question. We're going to link your website on the Custom Player so people can click on it, go directly to your website. But this would probably be a great time to tell us your website. How can they find you right now if they want to go look on the Internet for your website?
Yeah, it's very simple. It's www.dafeatherling, and that's FEATHERLING, all written together with no spaces, .com.
That's cool. And great website. You can order there and everything, guys, so just keep that in mind when we link that to her Custom Player tonight after the show. So, Dorothy, you advertise yourself as a fiction a la carte, and that may not be a familiar term for a lot of folks. So what does that mean, and then how does it translate into the books you write?
Well, Herdy, in a lot of restaurants, particularly upscale restaurants, they have 2 menus. They have the menu that has the set dinners, and then they have what they call the a la carte menu, where you order items individually according to your taste. And when I decided to get published, and I realized that I had books written in several different genres, several different kinds of books, I thought, this may be a little confusing for people. So I thought, well, it's kind of like going into that restaurant and looking at that a la carte menu, and they can go, oh, I want a mystery, or oh, I want a romantic comedy, or oh, I want an end times fiction book, or oh, I want nonfiction. And they can kind of go and see what interests them and pick the one that they like.
Yeah, so you've got all these different genres of books, and you can pick them individually. It's not just one area. So that kind of leads us to the next question. So far you've got, I think I'm right on this, 2 mystery series, a romantic comedy series, an end time series, as well as a nonfiction book. Can you give us an idea about how you brainstormed a book, say your first mystery?
Okay, well, I've always heard that a writer ought to write what they like to read. So since one of my favorite things to read are mysteries and suspense, I thought writing a mystery would be a great idea if I could do it, because I knew that you had to be fair with your reader and drop clues and those kinds of things, and I honestly didn't know if I could. So I decided to try. At the point in time when I decided to give this a shot, all I'd written were a romance and several romantic comedies, so I didn't know whether I'd be able to succeed, but decided to go ahead and try. So as a result, my first mystery series, entitled It's Murder at the Office, was born.
I read that book. Great book.
And I wanted to come up with a concept that was different, though. And, of course, that's not an easy task with all the thousands of mysteries that are on the market today. But in doing some thinking, I started what-ifing, which, by the way, is one of the writer's best tools of the trade. You start asking the question, what if? So I thought, if a woman had a good-paying, steady job and suddenly lost it, maybe because of a loss of funding for the position. And then what if, not able to find a comparable job, she decided to become a temporary worker to pay her bills? And I realized I'd never read any kind of a book, mystery or otherwise, about a temporary employee. Everybody uses them in business, but I don't think anybody's ever written about them. So I decided to make my heroine a temporary worker, and every time she changes jobs, she's going to encounter another murder. Well, that sounded good. I kept on what-ifing a little bit more. What if I made an office machine or an office procedure either the murder weapon or the reason for the murder in each book? Nobody had ever done that either. So once I kind of established those basic outlines for my mystery, then it was just a matter of figuring out how the murder was committed, who the murderer would be, and then playing fair with my readers by dropping clues so that they could figure out, if they could, who'd done it all the way to the conclusion.
Amazing. And that's a good book, by the way. I enjoyed reading it. It was good. It really was. I thought it was awesome. Cool. All right. So you've also published 4 romantic comedies. And I have some other questions after this main question. What's their common thread, if any, and do you intend to publish more of this type of book in the future?
Well, Herdy, romantic comedy is one of my favorite things to write. I love to write humor, and I enjoy writing in first person and putting my heroes and my heroines in situations that wind up getting them in all kinds of trouble. I put the 4 romantic comedies I've written into what I call the Second Time Around series. The books aren't related to each other in terms of plot or characters, but each one contains a character who's looking for love the second time around. They're kind of light, fun reads for people who enjoy humor mixed with some romance. I do have another romantic comedy that I hope to write soon. I've had this idea for several years and even started a couple of chapters at one point, but one of these days, a romantic comedy called Mrs. Santa's Secret List is going to be on the bookshelves for my fans to read.
Awesome. And my question within this question, if you don't mind me asking, Dorothy, I don't want to pull you off the questionnaire, but it seems like to me comedy is always would be kind of a difficult thing. It might be funny to you, right, when you're writing. So how do you come up the comedy side of it? Do you use like cliches in the book? How do you do that?
Well, actually, you don't really want to use a lot of cliches in your writing because that makes it pretty dated, unless, of course, you decide to create a character who spouts nothing but cliches, but that's kind of rare.
What if? I'm kidding. Go ahead.
I just have a weird mind.
Right.
I find humor in all kinds of situations, hopefully without being cruel or mean about it. But I've always just had this odd sense of humor that's kind of quirky, and so I find interesting things to write about. And so far, readers seem to really enjoy the humor, so I guess I must be on track with it.
I've been around you enough to see it. Yeah, and that's what I'm saying. I could see you writing out something like that, and I'm interested in reading those too. You've got a lot I need to catch up on. And so, you are going to do a couple of these in the future, which you mentioned. And so, you recently published a nonfiction book, which is awesome. Can you tell us a little bit about that book, how it came about?
Yeah, it was really pretty interesting. About 6 or 7 months ago, I got a phone call from a guy who was a local genealogist historian, and he'd seen an article that had been written about me in a magazine, and he wanted to know if I'd be interested in getting some information about a cold case murder that took place in Georgetown in 1930. Well, I kind of gave him a cautious maybe. And then he talked about a mysterious death in 1931 that occurred when a juror caused a mistrial and later died under unusual circumstances. Well, it sounded interesting, but that I didn't write nonfiction. So he said, oh, well, if you don't want to write the stories as nonfiction, you could maybe use them as the basis for a fiction novel. Well, being polite kind of person, I took down the names and phone numbers of the local folks that were the sources of information, told him I'd call them in a couple of weeks. And then a few weeks later, and mainly because I try to do what I say, I did call that first source, and the guy had been doing local interviews with folks in the area for over 10 years trying to get information about what really happened in the unsolved murder. So I met with him, and I listened to what he had to say, and brought his notes home and some newspaper clippings and looked everything over. And I had to admit, it was tempting, because it's not every day somebody offers an author their very own unsolved murder.
Sure.
But, I could also tell it would take me anywhere from an additional 3 to 6 months or more of research to really dig down and get more facts than he'd been able to gather so far. So I regrettably told him I just didn't have the time because of other projects I had planned, and that he'd need to find somebody else. Well, the only problem was I couldn't get the story out of my mind. Over the next couple of weeks, every time I had a few minutes, my thoughts would turn back to the murder. Morning, noon, night, didn't matter what I was doing. It kept playing over and over in my head. I started mentally writing openings to chapters and mentally outlining how the book could be put together. I just couldn't quit thinking about it. So I decided, okay, I'll talk to the other guy, the one that knows about the juror's death, and met with him. So that story was not a murder, but there was a murder trial involved, and again, it was interesting. So I finally figured God must be trying to tell me something, so I told them both, okay, I'll write your stories, and I'll do the research I need to do to finish it up, and then I'll put them both in one book, because neither of the stories was really long enough to fill an entire book on their own. And
sure.
Of course, without consciously realizing that at that point I had just begun another career, this time as a detective. My main problem was, how in the world did I investigate a murder case that was 84 years old?
Yeah.
So I quickly found out that the official records from law enforcement had long ago been destroyed. Necessary medical records had been sealed, and they were confidential forever. So it was a process of either finding people who were adults in 1930, and believe me, there's not many of them left, and kind of tapping into their memories about the two deaths. Or usually what happened is I would find folks who were alive at the time and asking what they'd heard about the cases as children or young adults. And then, of course, I went into researching in Texas newspapers and getting information and leads from there. So it was also interesting because I found out pretty quickly that even though people in small towns really do know each other's business, as we've all heard, after 84 years, a lot of them still don't want to talk about it, especially when there's been a murder involved.
Wow.
So it really wasn't until I decided to guarantee them that I wouldn't use any names of any people who were sources of information in the book that they began to tell me things that eventually came together in what I think is a logical solution to the murder case, which is written and named in the book.
That's cool. And that one's out. You can get that, right? We can go read it right now?
It is. I was published last December, and it's called Who Killed Ben Miller? And the companion story is Death of a Juror.
Unbelievable. How cool is that? Wow. And how long did it take? I'm curious, how long, once you got all the information, you got this wrapped up in your head, and we're publishing the chapters, how long did it take you to produce these two books within one?
It probably took me about between 4 and 6 months because, like I said, there was a good bit of research that had to be done. The writing of the book itself really didn't take that long, maybe a couple of months, but trying to get leads and talk to people and check with authorities, city, county, state organizations that would have had information that we couldn't get, that took a long time. So I would say the whole project took about 6 months, but only about 2 months of that was spent in actually doing the writing.
Were folks fairly open to talk to you about this?
Well, like I said, a lot of them were not because I really had a hard time understanding that because to me, something that happened 84 years ago,
kind of water under the bridge. Yeah.
I would have thought, but evidently there was a very strong feeling in the culture back in those days that you didn't talk about other people and you might fear reprisals if you did. And even though, all these people are long dead, I guess there's still some of that thinking that was left in a lot of the people I talked to, because like I said, I had to promise them I wouldn't use their name in the book if they'd talk to me. And finally they would do that.
All right, so let's switch gears a little bit. Lots of people think they want to write a book. We're in a culture today where people want to write a book and have their name on a book, and so they can say they wrote a book, right? So how would you encourage or discourage folks to do that?
Well, you know, Herdy, there are a million stories out there, and I'm convinced that we all have at least one book in us. I really believe that. You know, folks may wonder what they have to write about, but, you know, if you stop and think about it a minute, there's all kinds of possibilities. You know, maybe somebody had an unusual or difficult childhood. Maybe they've overcome physical or mental or emotional handicaps. You know, maybe they've traveled to exciting places. Maybe they're deep thinkers and want to share their ideas. And maybe they've done adventurous things. Or maybe they're sitting there thinking, nobody would want to read about me and my life. But, you know, we all have family, friends, brothers and sisters, church family, maybe students if we teach, clients, even total strangers. You know, sometimes you just need to get those words, ideas, or thoughts into a place where they can find expression. You know, grandmothers and grandfathers are sometimes gold mines of information. You know, you stop and think about some of the stories they used to tell about their lives. Some of them came west to help settle an untamed land, and maybe they started a business of some sort against all odds, and maybe they just lived a life worth imitating that might inspire somebody else. But when you really start thinking about it, we all have something to share. And those things, I mean, even if they only help or influence one other person, make a difference for the better. And I think that's what we're really about, is making a difference in each other's lives. And I think writing can help make that difference. You know,
yeah, go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, you know, these days more and more people are self-publishing, as I do, and it's not just to provide entertainment. They publish memoirs, nonfiction, poetry, recipes, hobbies, just about anything imaginable can be found in either printed or electronic form or both. You know, we've all heard stories from our parents and grandparents that they told us verbally, but the stories never got written down, and now the details are lost forever. So, you know, if anybody's listening and they can kind of resonate with any of these things, I'd really encourage them to give writing a try, because, you know, it doesn't make any difference if you use a pencil or paper or a computer. That might be another whole world waiting to open up for them. And of course, you're not on a deadline, so it doesn't matter if it takes 6 months or 6 years. So you just got to sit down and do it. So I really think everybody has a story to tell, and this would be a great time for people to start telling them.
Which kind of leads me to a question within that question. And Dorothy, I would imagine the hardest thing for somebody who wants to write a book would be the getting started process. Do you have a rule or a set of criteria, or how do you generally start when you have the idea? Can you kind of give me some feedback on that?
Well, you know, Herdy, they say that there are two kinds of writers, and this is people who write for a living, I guess you could say. One is what we call an outline person who actually sits down and prepares an outline, just sort of like they would for a speech or something like that, and outlines what they want to put in the book, and then they follow that outline as they go through the actual writing of it. The other ones are called SOPs, which stands for seat of the pants. And that means somebody has an idea and they just sit down and let their fingers start typing and come up and just see where the story moves and where it goes. A lot of authors do a little bit of both. I do a little bit of both. I usually know I have to have my title. That's always a must with me. I have to have my title first. And then I know how it's going to open, and I have a pretty good idea, of course, what the ending is going to be. But a lot of the details in between, when I begin, are not clear. So that's where the seat of the pants part comes in. But I think a lot of it, the main thing that you've got to do is just to decide you're going to be disciplined enough to do it, is to put your bottom in the chair and make yourself get started. And once you get started, then it's amazing how it'll kind of keep pulling you back to keep getting involved with it. And it's amazing, even if you only type, or write for 10 minutes a day, you'd be amazed how many words that mounts up to in a month's time and then a year's time.
I also have two additional questions, Dorothy, I'm going to ask you that are added to your list. The next one is, you mentioned earlier that you're self-published. I've looked at your books. They're bright, they're colorful, they're attractive. Can you explain a little bit about what it means to be self-published?
Well, that's something that's only come into being and respectability in the last few years. There are a couple of businesses out there that basically provide the means of publishing a book. It's what's called print on demand. Basically, you submit your manuscript and the cover, and they put it together into a finished product, a book, and then it's ordered as it's needed. You can order 1 copy or 5,000 copies. I publish through one called CreateSpace, which is owned by Amazon.com. And
thanks for listening to our broadcast tonight with author D.A. Featherling. Dorothy, thanks for being on the podcast. And guys, thanks for listening to the Hurdy Burke Internet Broadcast Network.